Hello, everyone. My name is Ben Hopkins, and I am the director of the East Asia National Resource Center at the George Washington University, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this event wherever you may be. For me here in Washington, D.C., it's a very humid September evening, but as we're doing this transcontinentally, at least in terms of the panel, it looks like a very nice day out in California. I hope it's good wherever you are these days. The one bright spot in this entire COVID mess is the ability to do things like this, where we can have not only a panel that stretches across the United States, but indeed a global audience and interaction. It is my great privilege and pleasure to welcome you to really the first partnership that my own National Resource Center, the East Asia National Resource Center at GW, is doing with a sister National Resource Center, that of the East Asian Institute of East Asian Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, as well as the Mongolia Initiative at the University of California, Berkeley. The National Resource Centers, you may know, are recipients of federal Title VI money and are recognized for their excellence in scholarship and teaching. And I think this will really put that on display tonight. So lest I drone on, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Caverly Carey, who's going to introduce our speaker tonight. Before I do so, I would just really quickly let you know this is being recorded, and we will have an opportunity for Q&A. In the right-hand side of your panel, you will see a Q&A place to put your questions. Please do go ahead and put those throughout the discussion. And when we open up for questions, we can go ahead and grab those there. So definitely be aware of that. So over to you, Caverly.
Thank you very much. My name is Caverly Carey of the Institute of East Asian Studies, and it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Marissa Smith. Marissa Smith is a Mongolia expert who has conducted extensive research in country, particularly concerning the flashpoint of mining in northern Mongolia. She completed her doctorate in anthropology at Princeton in 2015 with a dissertation entitled Treasure Underfoot and Far Away, Mining, Foreignness, and Friendship in Contemporary Mongolia. She has written on a very wide range of contemporary Mongolian affairs, including politics, sovereignty, labor, ethnography, contemporary socialism, pastoral nomadism, international corporations, and relations between Russians and Mongolians. She continues to follow issues surrounding mining in Mongolia. She has taught anthropology and world history. She has mentored students here in the US, and she has conducted training during extended field research trips in remote areas of Mongolia, experiential instruction in anthropological research techniques, and cross-cultural collaboration. She is currently writing about regional and local governance, raw material economies, and Mongolia-Russian relations. Her latest publication is Power of the People's Parties and a Post-Soviet Parliament, Regional Infrastructural, Economic, and Ethnic Networks of Power in Contemporary Mongolia in the Journal of Eurasian Studies. Marissa Smith is currently affiliated with the Central Asia Working Group at UC Berkeley's Institute of East Asian Studies and sits on the governing board of the American Center of Mongolian Studies. It is my pleasure to turn the mic over to Marissa Smith.
Thank you, Caverly, for that very nice introduction. And I'm really happy to be here. Thanks to everybody at George Washington U at the East Asian National Resource Center, and also thanks to the Institute for East Asian Studies at Berkeley. So this is a really cool event to be part of and a cool initiative. Yeah, so I will just get right into it. So this is a presentation about Mongolia's coronavirus response. I think we should go to the next slide, which actually has the title. Oh, it doesn't. That's my fault. But anyway, this is very topical as well. So the talk is called Landlocked, Cosmopolitan Locks Down. And I actually came up with the title and the abstract for the talk some months ago, I think, at this point. But it's very much still relevant to talking about COVID and Mongolia. As you can see from this chart, right, I think we're all fairly familiar with these sorts of charts by now. Mongolia's graph looks a little bit different than most localities, right? we see like a smattering of these spikes. So landlocked Cosmopolitan, basically Mongolia has completely closed its borders. I will go into the details about that, but their borders are still pretty much completely closed. And they are flying people in on chartered flights. So what you see of these spikes are people coming in on those chartered flights. And there have been a couple of occasions where large numbers of people have tested positive. But overall, as you can see, since January, there have only been 310 confirmed cases, and they have no deaths in the country. There have been a couple of cases of Mongolian citizens who were abroad who have died from COVID. But anyway, those, as I think everyone is now kind of familiar with the intricacies of the counting, those kind of don't really count under Mongolia's numbers itself. Mongolia still has no community spread, and that is certainly influencing how things are happening on the ground as well. Okay, I will go to the next slide, please. All right, so the main thing I want to emphasize, kind of as sort of what's happening right now, these repatriation flights. So this is a picture. Everything in this, and this is a tweet. Obviously, everything is in Mongolian, but you can see that it's a group of people protesting. I'm actually going to go to the next slide really quickly and come back to this one if that's all right. Okay, this one is in English. So this is a couple of protesters, and there were many more people protesting, and they have signs in English. And I believe that this was the Mongolian embassy in Budapest in Hungary. So there are many Mongolians living abroad, working abroad, some in, obviously very kind of working in restaurants and steel mills and things like that. But there's also a lot of students, and these students have been sort of the face of these protests about getting back to Mongolia. So this is what these two people are demonstrating about. So there have been flights chartered by the Mongolian government using the national airline to go to various cities to collect people, but in the last month or two, the number of flights has increased and more people have gotten back into the country, but there's still issues as well with the cost of the flights in particular is what I'm hearing about now. So if I can go back to that other slide really quickly, it's in Mongolian, but it sort of lists very specifically what their concerns are. So on the right there, those bullets there, people are upset that it's only the national airline. The national airline only has 2 767s, so the number of flights they can run are fairly limited, and they are flying to the US and to Australia, but for instance, there's been no flights to Canada. I know some people who are disgruntled about that. And there's concerns about corruption with that airline as well. I spoke with a friend who's been living in Australia for the last several years, and I spoke to her like last week actually, and she told me her mother had been in Australia with her, and she had just gotten onto a flight, I think like 2 weeks ago from Sydney. I could probably check that because I have the dates of all the flights. But anyway, her mother had actually just flown back to Mongolia, and she didn't complain about corruption or anything about getting onto the flight. But she said that the flight was 3 times the cost that it normally would have been to get back. So the costs are an issue, and that's also before you get into the costs of the quarantining that you also have to pay when you get back to Mongolia, which I'll get into in a bit. So the second bullet point there, or sorry, the third bullet point is about they want to only have to quarantine in Mongolia for 14 days instead of 21 days. So the Mongolian government is actually enforcing quarantine, and these are like in hotels. You can't leave for 21 days, and people want that to be rolled back to 14 days. The third one, I think maybe like they want to isolate in groups, but I think that's a thing now. And then finally also testing capacity. I'm not going to translate all those signs, but you can see there's a lot of signs, and it's similar to those English language signs before. There's a lot of people talking about human rights and things like that. Okay, if we can go to the next slide, please. And then to the next slide. So here's a cartoon that's I think this is a few months old now, but so the plight of students has been sort of the face of these narratives about people trying to get back. So this is a woman who's saying, "Hey, Dad, I've come from like the ends of the earth, essentially. Let me back in." And the father is saying, like, "Yeah, no, so this is how there've been pretty strong feelings about this issue, and it's an ongoing one." Next, please. So this is an infographic from last month about the number of flights they had to repatriate people, just so you can get a sense of the number of flights, and then where they're coming from. And so these planes have never flown to the US or Australia before this time. Next, please. And then that's the latest list for September, just so you can get a sense of how many flights there are. So there's 1 flight to Seattle. Most of the flights are to elsewhere in Asia. There's 2 flights to Frankfurt, 1 flight to Istanbul. So, it's still a fairly limited number of flights to get people back into Mongolia. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so just before kind of giving you that sense of what's kind of the main issue people are talking about right now, so going back to January, so Mongolia took action very, very, very quickly. They flew Mongolia. They took Mongolians back from Wuhan February 1st. There were 31 Mongolians who were flown back. They closed the border with China January 31st. And when I mean they closed the border, at that point, actually, they closed the border even to coal exports. And exports of minerals to China are a huge part of Mongolia's economy. So that was a very big deal. And at that time, they said that they were going to do that until March 2nd, and they ended up doing it until March 23rd. They closed schools and kindergartens on January 26th, and they ended up, really, really locking things down. Next slide, please. So this is some images from the Mongolian Lunar New Year festivities. So that was at the end of January, and so for me, it was, I'm in California, so actually this was also around when it was starting to register for me, that it was getting kind of serious in the US as well. And I was seeing these images of in Mongolia, they were celebrating the Lunar New Year. Everybody, on all of the news broadcasts of any time in Mongolia, everybody was wearing masks all the time, but you see these images of the monks at the main monastery beginning the New Year festivities wearing masks. And if you go to the next slide. So this is all of the monks assembled in the main monastery. And at this point, you might say this is like, okay, this is not good social distancing. But at this point, actually, they were very stringently enforcing that people don't go and visit their families. So in Mongolia, the Lunar New Year festivities basically last 3 days. And the main thing that you do is you go and you visit everybody you know, especially older people. So they really tried to stop people from visiting each other. And you could also see very easily from the internet that there were campaigns of like, do your Lunar New Year greetings over the internet. And people I know were doing this and sort of, posting parts of it on Instagram and things like that. So that was very visible. There were also people doing sort of like medicine type things where they were like shaming people, like taking photographs of them waiting outside of an apartment building and taking a picture and posting it online and saying, hey, don't do this. It was also around this time that the US government decided to pull out Peace Corps volunteers from Mongolia. So Mongolia has a very large number of Peace Corps volunteers. And one of the Peace Corps volunteers had been telling me that, like the police were actually outside of people's apartments, like people who were supposed to be, who were suspected cases or things like that. So, there was like pretty strict enforcement of things happening. And anyway, the Peace Corps volunteers also got pulled out just because of these very strict, not only were at this point where the borders locked down, but there were also restrictions on moving in between different cities. And it was just deemed, too much of a safety risk, right? Because you can't get people, if there was emergency, the Peace Corps volunteers, like the roads were all closed. You couldn't go to the capital, so you couldn't go in or out of the country. So really, really strict measures were taken. On February 28th, the Mongolian president visited China, and he was, I think he was the first head of state to visit China during that time. And he very publicly said, I'm going into quarantine for, I think at that time they were still saying 2 weeks, but he very publicly said, I'm going into isolation. So something about Mongolia that people might, who don't know as much about Mongolia on the call, might be sort of thinking Mongolia is sort of like the Central Asian countries. Some of the Central Asian countries, of course, notably like Turkmenistan, right? Like they're still sort of denying that coronavirus is a thing. Mongolia never really went there at all. Like it was always, the government was always very serious about it. The government officials have always been very, I haven't heard of any single case of any of them downplaying the seriousness of this. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, so this was another cartoon that came out on Facebook and other social media in March. So there was a lot of discourse about we have to undertake these really strict measures to protect children. So you can see there's a kid on the right side there. And children there were even rules in place about like children being in public places at the time. So that was a lot of what the discourse was about. Everyone has to unite together to fight the virus, to protect the children. Next slide, please. And this was another one, right? So this includes members of the police and the border patrol units, of course, doing this sort of very traditionalist image as well on horseback. So this is very much considered to be like a national security problem as well. Next slide, please. And so there has also been some very interesting sort of diplomacy going on with Mongolia and other countries. So Mongolia has received aid, but has also been giving aid. This is a tweet that's from August, but it's referring to something that happened several months before, where the Mongolian government, I think this actually happened like during the visit of the president of Mongolia to China in February. The Mongolians gifted 30,000 sheep to China to help the efforts. There was also the first flight that went to Seattle from Ulaanbaatar was carrying, it wasn't carrying people, it was going to bring Mongolians back, and it was actually full of personal protective equipment. And there's actually some nice local news station coverage from Seattle showing the ceremony where the Mongolian ambassador to the US is giving this, presenting this PPE to the United States government. Okay, next slide. So that is sort of January to March and June 2020. So the main thing that happened in June 2020, of course, Mongolia had elections. And of course, there were elections in a couple of other countries in conditions of coronavirus, but Mongolia was one of the few. So there were also elections in South Korea and Singapore, if you want to sort of look at that comparatively. And so sort of before June, March 25th, actually, the president, Batulga, he actually, he proposed postponing elections, these parliamentary elections. This was strongly opposed by the prime minister, Khorolsuk. And what ended up happening was Khorolsuk and his party won in a landslide. But anyway, yeah, so that's interesting that there was actually a proposal on the table to actually postpone the parliamentary elections. It was also actually supported by another powerful person in the currently powerful party that won the elections, but his wing actually kind of got voted out. Not that any of these things are necessarily connected, but just kind of laying the sort of scene for the elections. The elections went went pretty well. I will show you a few slides so you can sort of see how coronavirus measures played out there. Next slide, please. All right, so there were measures put in place, particularly for the elections, and there were a lot of images of people wearing PPE. So this is that, and some of them were, of course, wrapped into the campaign, right? So this person is a member of a party that they didn't actually. I think they got one person into the parliament, but they sort of ran on this platform of we're all very well-educated young people. So it's not surprising that this actually featured in his campaign video, where he's actually like masking up and like putting on gloves and stuff. And this individual is actually also like a mining. He's a mining engineer. On the Cosmopolitan, in some of these photos, you'll also see people wearing. So that guy is wearing an LA Dodgers t-shirt. Again, Mongolians are very cosmopolitan. Yeah, so this was one of the best kind of images I found of somebody really kind of prominently putting on the PPE and sort of showing, hey, I'm a scientific cultured person and I'm taking Mongolia's safety seriously through this. Next slide. So this is actually a former president of Mongolia and his son, and they're at a rally, and they're not wearing the PPE themselves. They're on the front of a stage, but if you look in the background, actually, it's almost everyone is wearing a mask. I don't want to misrepresent the situation and sort of say that like every single campaign photo I saw, everyone was wearing a mask, because that's by far from true. But yeah, there are examples of things like this where you do see many people wearing masks. Next slide, please. So you may be thinking Mongolia is a very rural country, right? It's this huge landlocked country between Russia and China that has 3 million people, but it's the size of the western half of the United States. The continental United States is a huge country. It's very rural. So this is an image from a rural area in northern Mongolia. Actually, the campaign team landed at the beginning of this video. They landed like a helicopter that's owned by a gold mining company. And there's only a couple people in this photo wearing masks, and they're kind of hard to spot. So this was a fairly well financed campaign. I would take it because this is one of the two major parties, and this is actually the president's party. And this is a fairly contested region, this this province. So yeah, so that's an example of one where you don't see many people wearing masks. And then the next slide, finally, about sort of mask discourse during the elections. Towards the beginning of the elections, unfortunately, there was also some xenophobic stuff going on, where there's a Kazakh minority that lives in far western Mongolia, and I was not surprised to see this, but of course it's disappointing. But there were people posting pictures of a rally, saying like, oh, these people in Mongolia, these Kazakhs are so uncultured and they're not doing any social distancing. No one's wearing a mask, right? So definitely there's some degree of kind of mask theater and sort of who's doing things right and who's not doing things right. But of course, too, so by this time in June, Mongolia is doing pretty well. They still today have no community spread. They were bringing in these chartered flights of people and handling it really well, even though, there was a massive spike in mid-May where I think it was, 347 people came in from Russia, and their case count went up by 92 cases in a single week. So, they had to deal with testing all of these people, quarantining them. Some of them were quarantined, I think, outside of the capital. Some of them came down, obviously, with very serious coronavirus and had to be treated in the state hospital, which has, only a couple hundred beds. So, they're doing very well, and people were the restrictions inside on internal movement and all those things had been lifted, and there was good reason to do that. Also, I want to point out, because I think this is not really getting enough notice in sort of the recent things. There's been several articles actually just in August about coronavirus and Mongolia. And May 25th, so that's just a couple of weeks before the election, the prime minister at the time, who is still the prime minister now because his party won in a landslide, he announced May 25th that Mongolia is not going to open until there's a vaccine. So, there's the prospect of Mongolia continuing to be closed for months and months. And of course, if you're outside of Mongolia, you're watching things become more and more normal inside the country. So I don't know of any other cases in the world where something like this is happening. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, so if we go to what's happening right now, so September 1st, they've opened schools, kids are going to school, and you'll see in this picture, nobody's wearing a mask. None of the kids are wearing masks. The president is not wearing a mask. So it seems like things inside Mongolia are proceeding pretty normally. Also, I was just reading on Facebook about people going to see the Mulan movie, in theaters. It's pretty unthinkable if you're in California right now, like me. But then again, on the other hand, this issue of people not being able to repatriate to Mongolia. I also wanted to note that there was a protest in July 10th in Washington, D.C. as well, like that. Next slide, please. There are also, interestingly, people wearing masks at these protests too. So that's another thing we could make up. So this is actually a protest about a completely different issue, but something that is coming into everyone's consciousness right now who works on Mongolia-related issues. So which has been directing actually a lot of my attention in the last 2 weeks. The Chinese government has instituted bilingual language in Inner Mongolia, which means that they're substantially decreasing the amount of Mongolian language education. So there had been complete education in Mongolian in many schools in Inner Mongolia, and that's being ended. So there have been protests, many protests in Ulaanbaatar. There was one yesterday or 2 days ago in San Francisco that was small. There's one in DC. So this is just a picture from that, and you can see everyone is wearing a mask, and people were using the masks as a means of protest. But yeah, this also really contrasts. If you look at pretty much anything happening in Mongolia right now, like, you will not see this many masks. But this is Washington, DC. Okay, next slide, please. So what are we going to be looking at going forward? So as I said, Mongolia has been doing pretty well controlling the inflows of people, keeping the case counts relatively low, dealing with all of that. But this is all hitting their economy pretty hard, is what the outlook looks like. Also, there's the issue of the winters coming up, and Ulaanbaatar, the capital city, where something like half of the population lives, and you have to go to the capital city to do a lot of things. It's a very, very centralized country. They have some of the worst air pollution in the world. Last winter, it was somewhat improved, partly because of the COVID lockdown measures, but also the government has had some success in instituting reforms into what's being burned that was causing some of the pollution. But yeah, so the winter is coming again, and huge amounts of air pollution exacerbating people's lungs. If there is an increase in cases, community spread, something like that, that could be disastrous, right? So we're looking at that possibility again. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the economic issues, and that's going to be the final section of my talk, and we can open it up to some Q&A. Okay, next slide, please. So, as you may know, Mongolia is a very heavily export-based economy, heavily minerals-based economy. This is from 2018. This those nice MIT Observatory of Economic Complexity visualizations, where you can see just how much of their economy is based on exporting coal and copper and gold as well. Pretty much all of that, not just the red stuff, is minerals related. As I mentioned before, when they locked the border down in January, they actually were preventing the coal from getting out. So the coal gets trucked out across the southern border to China. And they didn't start doing those exports again until March 23rd. And I didn't actually take any screenshots of this, but at that time, there were these images of the coal truck drivers wearing like full white hazmat PPE. So that was pretty dramatic. So that has taken the toll on their economy. I haven't seen anything as far as a decreased demand for the coal or the other products from China, but that is something that I've been reading about from other countries in the region, especially like gas exporting countries are reporting that there's less demand from China. So that could be an issue. Interestingly enough, with gold, the gold prices went up, and also a lot of gold is believed to be taken out of Mongolia illegally. But there has been a very measurable increase in the amount of gold that's been sold to the Mongolian central bank, which is the legal way to deal with gold in Mongolia. So the gold smuggling has taken a huge hit, and the Mongolian government has been able to benefit from that. So that's one sort of bright spot in the economically. As far as copper, the copper price unfortunately declined. The other big problem there is, so one of the, there's two very large copper mines in Mongolia. One of them is run by a large international company, Rio Tinto, which runs other large mining company copper mines throughout the world. They've had to delay the expansion of this Oyu Tolgoi mine, partly due to COVID. So reading their latest financial reports is pretty interesting. So there's a delay there as well. And this is also problematic for Mongolia. Mongolia has a huge level of external debt, and they have bonds coming due soon. So, you know, this puts them in a difficult position where officially this mine can't be expanded. I was also going to mention that Mongolia never declared a state of emergency due to COVID. They did make a law sort of setting out saying that, hey, we're not gonna step on any human rights or go against the Constitution due to this coronavirus. So they have like sort of a state of alert, but they very strictly said we're not declaring sort of a state of emergency where anything goes. And they did do a stimulus package, but if you read the stimulus package text, which I did, it's mostly saying we're going to increase the amount of mining, we're going to increase our agricultural production, we're going to basically just export more stuff, which is also what a lot of the elections campaigns said for the parliamentary elections in June. And the sorts of assistance that they got through with that stimulus package were mostly direct cash transfers for like related to how many children are in households, to the tune of, if you add it all up, it's like $100 a month or something, and that's going to expire October 1st. There may have been more recent ones that are not on my radar, but that was sort of the level of like direct economic support to citizens. And there has at least been talk of tax breaks and things like that, but I'm not quite sure where the state of that is since the new parliament has come in. So yeah, they're facing some real economic challenges. Just to kind of give you some numbers, there was just a story on the main sort of national news platform, Matsume today or yesterday, saying that the foreign trade turnover decreased by 16.3%. compared to the same period the previous year. So, that's significant. So definitely we'll be watching that. Yeah, and I think, oh yeah, one more slide. So I also wanted to highlight that there's an organization called Breathe Mongolia. They have previously been really involved in, this is an organization that's mostly young Mongolian professionals who are doing this on their own time. So they put together this really nice infographic, and they're trying to be a watchdog for what happens with all of this aid money that Mongolia is getting related to COVID, but they also have put together a really nice coronavirus timeline that includes some of the things I mentioned. I also mentioned some additional things. But yeah, so this is an infographic about what kind of aid Mongolia has gotten strictly related to coronavirus. Some of the other ADB, for instance, is also pushing ahead with a package to increase infrastructure at the borders to facilitate this program of exporting more stuff. So we'll see how that goes. But yeah, just it's still kind of, we don't really know much about how this money is actually being spent by the Mongolian government, but they are getting aid. So that's where we're at with that. Okay, I think I'm going to just end there. I know we have a lot of people on the call, so I think I'll just end a few minutes earlier than I was scheduled to, just so we have more time for question and answer.
Great. All right, Marissa, thank you very much for a really interesting and engaging overview of Mongolia's response here. A couple of things to the audience. Again, on your right-hand panel, you have a Q&A panel that if you open up, you can type a question in there, which I will be sure gets to Marissa. I understand some of you are having some difficulty with WebEx. I apologize. It's all of these Zoom, WebEx, and such have their own little quirks, as it were. I would also point out that there's a survey we have for today's discussion. You can see the QR code that you can scan and fill out. So if you'd like to pile on to WebEx or any such thing, that would actually be quite appreciated, because next time we do this, then we can set that back up. So I'm not seeing any questions coming in yet, so I encourage you to go ahead and do so. In the meantime, we've got one that's actually just come in, and this is from, I'm going to apologize for my mispronunciations, Anthropologist Batzel, and his question is, a variety of reactions from Turkmenistan to denying it, to Korea managing it as effectively as possible. Why do you think Mongolia has had the reaction it has, Marissa?
Well, I was actually going to mention too that Mongolia has had a pretty strong record in the past of dealing with these kinds of events. For instance, with bird flu, they had a very extensive regime of testing. I remember I was there at one point, and they were, I was reading in the Mongolian news about how they were testing birds like all over the country to make sure that it wasn't in Mongolia. Also, when things got really intense with bird flu, there was a curfew. And I remember reading a report from one of the relevant international agencies. I don't know if it was the WHO or something, but there was a consultant who was just kind of writing their own article to say how impressed they were that Mongolia had instituted this curfew and how Mongolians had really gone along with it really well. Also, I sort of hesitated to bring up Bubonic Plague just because there's been so much, fake news about it. But, Mongolia, like Bubonic Plague is a real thing in Mongolia, and it happens, every year there's at least, one big case, but they have a very effective system of locking down areas where it happens. There's actually a really interesting film an American filmmaker made recently that has some cuts from socialist era black and white films that show really well this system, even from the 1960s. But yeah, like if there's a case of bubonic plague in a marmot or something in a local county, essentially at the county level, like they lock the borders down and people can't come in or out. And if they do come in and out, there's actually like people spraying down the trucks, checking people's vehicles to make sure they're not taking marmot meat in and out and things like that. So, and obviously bubonic plague is something Mongolians have been dealing with for centuries. So, you know, I think that there's some stuff there with that. And
great. Zach Levine asks, do you think that the Chinese decision to institute bilingual education in Inner Mongolia is at all related to Mongolia's decision to remain closed at the border for so long?
I don't think so. I actually not picked up any signs that there were any. I think Mongolia and China probably really coordinated closely with that on that. As I mentioned, the Mongolian president went to China in February to coordinate, and there have been several visits and exchanges since then. So at that level, Mongolian-Chinese relations seem good. I don't think that it has anything to do with retaliating against Mongolia, the country. Yeah.
We have another one from a graduate student at the University of Hawaii, Manoa. Haliun Gambatar says, I am one of the students who were not able to go back home during the summer as the borders were closed to citizens and the chances getting on the charter flights were slim. There are still thousands of Mongolians stranded abroad and not able to go back home. Do you think this is violating any human rights issues? Shouldn't everyone be able to go home during crisis situations? And if I could use my position as moderator just to expand on that slightly, has the government after the election made any further public statements about future plans for bringing people back?
Yeah, well, first of all, Haliun, I'm really sorry to hear that, and thanks for your comments and sharing with us your experience. I hope it helps alleviate the situation in some way. I am from what I'm seeing in the discourse. So the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is posting these schedules. So I showed a couple of slides of those where they're basically announcing like, hey, these are going to be the flights, and people have to basically manage to get a seat on those flights, and they have to be able to pay for it. And many Mongolians still outside are saying, hey, this is inadequate. And right now the demands are find other ways to get in. So there was the cases of Mongolians in Europe. There were cases of people reports of people actually, getting in cars and driving across Russia and going to the border and not being allowed in. I haven't heard of that happening. So I don't know if anyone, there are people in the call more knowledgeable than me about the debates about that, but I think that people may be being allowed to cross the land border with Russia right now. I'm not totally sure, but yeah, I think it's a significant issue, and certainly many people are saying that there are human rights issues here with not being able to go back to their own country. Yeah. And of course, right, many people are on student visas and other visas, and they can't renew their visas and things like that. So it's really an international issue, and it's of course not just Mongolians who are in these situations. Yeah.
Well, interestingly, we have a bit of a conversation going on in the Q&A around this particular point, as Bolor Lakjab from the University of San Francisco actually takes the opposite side of this and writes, so far Mongolia has the lowest number of COVID cases and 0 deaths, despite people who are abroad wanting to go back, protesting on social network and on the streets. Shouldn't the government continue using this method as it's working? So perhaps you could expand on your thoughts and perhaps relate that to the previous question.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're basically trying to maintain the response and open up more. And from what I've seen, like the numbers of people being repatriated has increased in recent weeks. And some people are pointing out like, hey, can we get more facilities inside Mongolia to quarantine people? Can we lower this period of days from 21 days to 14 days? So yeah, it seems like the issue now is balancing, maintaining this response, this is very effective maintenance of keeping Mongolia having few cases while maybe being able to ramp up the repatriation further. That seems to be the issue now.
So we have another question from Ulzi Jargal, who's currently at Johns Hopkins here in the United States at the University of Maryland, another student, who asked if you can expand on your thoughts regarding the wearing of mask and issues around that in Mongolia, as you mentioned in your slide.
Oh, sorry, I had a little noise on my end. Could you repeat the last bit of that?
Yeah, just the questioner asked you, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on wearing masks and issues around them in Mongolia, as you mentioned in your slide.
Oh, maybe they're referring to the issue of maybe expecting everyone in rural areas to wear masks all the time, or
why don't you start?
I don't know. With what?
Why don't you start with the rural areas and perhaps expand into the urban spaces?
Oh, well, I mean, quite frankly, I mean, it's Mongolia is a very large country, very dispersed population. The capacity in rural areas is not good. I don't know much about how masks, if masks had been distributed previously. That's something interesting to look at. Or it seems to me that it's just basically been decided by the public health authorities, who I think are doing a good job, have decided to just not, at this point in time, really pressure people to wear masks. And it seems like all along, the prospect of sort of providing everyone with masks, like as was done in Singapore, just hasn't really been an option. There just hasn't been the capacity to do it.
So related to that, I don't have a name for this questioner, but they ask if you could maybe expand on people's reactions to the public health measures in Mongolia at the present. And in particular, this questioner is referencing some protests against some of the more invasive or stricter lockdown measures in some countries. Are you seeing any protest against public health measures in Mongolia? Why or why not? And what is your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I the whole time have not seen any signs of protest against any of the measures. And you know, there were also extensive campaigns of like hand washing, right? And people do have good access to soap and, you know, hygiene. It's a former socialist country. You know, there were extensive hygiene campaigns. If you go to the countryside and stay with people who are nomadic herders, like you'll see they have toothbrushes, you know, tucked into the roof beams of their yurt. So the hygiene is very much something that is just kind of par for the course for them. Again, the protests have all been around getting people back into the country who are locked out. I'll also mention that one of the politicians who was affiliated with one of the third parties during the elections, who was able to, no one in his party got elected, but they were fairly visible. They had the funds through the campaigns and whatnot. He's actually pretty much switched completely to campaigning about this issue of repatriating Mongolians. So that's what the protests have been about.
Well, now that you bring up a politician, we actually have a question from Urga Azat, who asked, do you think elections, both the past parliamentary elections and upcoming local elections, have influenced and are continuing to influence how the government is managing COVID? As an expert who works on Mongolia extensively, do you see a pattern of oppressive governance lately in the COVID era?
I would say that so going back to kind of the discourses around the repatriation, something that people were saying a lot was it was hard to get onto these flights, partly because you had to have connections. So there's a formal process whereby people who are older, people who have small children, pregnant women, people in special categories are supposed to be given priority. But whether that was being carried out was really coming under question. So I do have the anecdotal case of my friend in Australia who told me her mother had just flown back, and they're not a fairly wealthy, they're not like a super wealthy family. Like my friend's mother used to live in a Gare district. Like she didn't even live in an apartment, in like 2012. So they got on a flight, but then also she noted this flight cost 3 times the normal cost. So I'm thinking it probably cost them like, something like $4,000 maybe, even something like that. There were newspapers in the United States saying that a ticket on the flight from the Seattle flight from the US to Mongolia was like, I think $2,500 or something. And this is a lot of money for Mongolians. People are lucky if they make a few $100s a month, if they're a white collar professional making a few $100s a month. So, and then you have to pay the costs of quarantine once you get back to Mongolia, which I think is something like $20 a day. But yeah, like this is a really big financial burden for people. So what this is exposing again is that like people are very very much into the following the hygiene rules, doing the right scientific cultured thing to do, but it's difficult for them to do some of these things, and there's definitely questions being raised about people profiting off of some of the measures, particularly the flights. It's interesting, I haven't really heard anything about people profiting potentially off of like hotels. So a lot of people are being quarantined in these hotels. I don't know, that might pop up at some point, but yeah, so that's what I would say is the issue. Those are the concerns: corruption and inequalities of wealth and people potentially profiting off the situation.
So we've got another question here from Steve Literati, who actually asks about Mongolian diplomacy and soft power in the present situation. And that is that we have heard that South Korea worked extensively on using its success with COVID to promote its image abroad, the kind of classic soft power. Has there been a sustained and clear effort by the Mongolian government to promote its success in terms of its response to COVID abroad? And if so, what is that strategy? And do you see any changes coming down the pike if the COVID numbers increase? So yeah, how is the government, as it were, if not selling it domestically, using its success to sell its image internationally?
I think that Mongolia is it's certainly being, the success in the low cases are certainly being highlighted, but in terms of its partners, I mean, its partners are its usual partners, and I think the Mongolian government is looking ahead to how they're going to deal with the continuing problems, and these are global economic problems, right? It doesn't matter how many cases Mongolia has if the copper price declines 15%. That's going to be a huge hit to their economy, things like that. So they also made a symbolic exchange with Russia where they donated meat to Russia. But at the end of the day, Mongolia also is maintaining these relationships with its neighbors and with the U.S. As they're going to be needing more aid from these countries as well. So it's the sort of COVID diplomacy, I think, has really followed this pattern of diplomacy Mongolia has been having for a long time, of kind of maintaining its friendships in the region. And Mongolia always wants to position itself, of course, not simply as an aid recipient, but that is a concern right now. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Not to abuse my position as chair, but as a follow-on question, I wonder, has there been any discussion about the kind of diplomacy around a potential vaccine? I mean, on the one hand, there's, the kind of great power politics, Russia, Putin, announcing he gave it to his daughter, and Russia's winning the race, as it were. China obviously is pushing very hard, as is the Trump administration. And I wonder, you brought up in your answer right there, Mongolia's kind of liminal position between Russia and China, and also its ongoing relationship with the United States. Has it said anything publicly about the vaccine in particular, and how it's trying to either gain access to that or use that in a diplomatic way?
Well, so they've also really highlighted that they're working with the WHO really closely. So there was actually just a press release about Mongolia being part of a program through the WHO. I think it's called COVAX. And that is a program that's not limited to the region. That is a program that's intended to get, lower middle income countries like Mongolia to have access. So they're definitely, again, it's an example of Mongolia being, again, a landlocked cosmopolitan and being like, hey, we have all of these relationships, and we're maintaining all these relationships, and we'll get a vaccine through one of these channels. Definitely.
Well, I'll say you've gotten the participants' interest, because we now have quite a backlog of questions, which is always good to see. So I'll try and get through as economically as possible. I had one here from Jennifer Kastner from the Altai Project. And she says, I'm curious if you feel that numbers are accurate and testing border closings are truly effective. Has there been an uptick in excess mortality that we are seeing in other countries with community spread?
So actually, in the winter, as I understand, the rates of pneumonia went down in relation to previous years, and this was a multi-causal thing. There was some improvement in the air pollution due to using coal substitute, different coal products, but also people were not moving around as much. Kids were not going to school, obviously, right? Kids going to school is a huge mechanism for contagion of all sorts of things that cause pneumonia. So actually, what I had gathered is there were declines in mortality. So there's someone named Robert Ritz who has done some data science about speculating what sort of numbers we would be seeing if there was community spread that we didn't know about. I haven't heard or seen anybody arguing that there is community spread that we don't know about in Mongolia. And the borders, I wouldn't say that people don't ever smuggle or cross borders when they're not supposed to, but the borders are pretty well controlled. I mean, it's Russia, Mongolia, and China. And if you look at the history of those borders as well in the last, second half of the 20th century, there have been military skirmishes, on those borders. It's not like people are just kind of crossing wherever they feel like. So I think if I heard the question correctly, it was are people really coming in and out that we don't know about? Is there actually community spread? And I would say I think no to both of those questions. And I would refer you to Robert Ritz's website. And
great. We have another Mongolian student who's sadly stuck out of the country, who has both a comment and question that I think is worth returning to and expanding on. Terry from Mongolia writes, first of all, thank you for opening this discussion publicly, leading the protest of Mongolian students stuck in Europe. Actually, she writes, I was sitting next to the person who drew one of the pictures you showed us. Mongolia closed its borders to citizens since March, and many people stuck outside of the country and couldn't go back, and we think it violates our fundamental rights. What is your opinion of this? Also, I think it needs to be noted Mongolia's quick response to COVID is hugely linked to government election in June. Our PM had to prove himself because another big new party was participating in this year's election. After the election, the PM's party used COVID to as an excuse to shut out his opponent's business. So just to kind of summarize and rephrase, you have, with the previous question, talked about the human rights issue, but I think Terry in particular is inquiring about the political aspects of the lockdown, and maybe if you could expand on those.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the case of the political reasons. It sounds like there's. I hadn't heard about this. I will definitely look it up. I would love to look more into it. But again, yeah, expressing concerns that the virus is being politicized to do things, to do corrupt things, and I think that is a real concern. Also, this is probably a good time to mention that around the election, actually right before the elections, several very prominent former parliamentarians who were also involved in the mining business and things were arrested, and they were sentenced, like they're in prison now, you know. And this happened. It's not unprecedented that there have been arrests of people around elections that were clearly motivated, politically motivated, related to the elections, including that former president I showed you, and he actually wasn't allowed to run again as a parliamentarian. But like the scale of it this year, that like 4 people, and then they were actually sentenced to prison terms. Like the scale of it is larger than previous years. So I think that I would back up the commenter and say that like there are concerns that like things are there are issues of government power being misused right now, and COVID is a possible mechanism for people to do that.
Well, on that point, we have a couple of questioners, Bolor Lakjav from San Francisco and Bjorn Reichhardt, who are both asking about aid and accountability. They both note that the government has been criticized for its use of COVID-19 funds, that there hasn't been much transparency with that. And they're asking, in effect, if there are any ways to trace how those funds have been used for COVID-related issues by the Mongolian government. And kind of along with that as well, do you see the potential misuse of funds in this, if that were to be the case and publicly proven, would have any kind of long-term detrimental effects to the Mongolian government in terms of its ability to then access future international aid?
Well, there being issues with international aid and where the money goes, and then ongoing corruption scandals, is certainly nothing new to Mongolia. I don't know that I would be hesitant to say that it would affect Mongolia's access to those funds in the future. But yeah, it's definitely a concern, and I share that concern with Bolor and Bjorn. I don't think I know more than they know about it. I would also just again say that the folks at Breathe Mongolia who put together that last infographic I showed, I know that they're working on this, trying to figure out how to be a watchdog essentially for this aid and see how it's being spent. But I think we're running into like longer term issues that are just fundamental to international development, right? Which also this goes beyond COVID, is what I'm trying to say too. So that is also a huge problem with any international aid in Mongolia related to other products, and it's not just related to Mongolia either. Yeah. And I'm a little concerned that if you look at the biggest donor so far has been the Asia Development Bank, right? Which is like like they are funding industrial things at the end of the day. They're not doing it sort of philanthropically. So if you look at their latest press release too, this is very obvious, because they're like, we've got this great new package that's COVID relief, but it's also like, you know, these huge new free trade zones at the borders. So it's fairly obvious, you know, what their prerogatives are.
Janet Roberts asks, what is the status of foreign residents in Mongolia? She specifically lists a number of aid agencies and international development agencies and such. I would just actually add on to that, as she does as well. What about in marriage of foreign residents? I mean, obviously one can think about foreigners from the far abroad, as it were, either Europeans or Americans, et cetera. But also, what about foreigners from the near abroad, as it were, and how are they being treated through this?
I haven't. I'm in some Facebook groups that involve Russian speakers and people with Russian citizenship who have family ties in Mongolia, and most of what's happening in that Facebook group is people being like, "Can I cross the border yet? No, you can't." You know, like, we'll figure out how to keep trying or something. People who are in Mongolia, who are the other sort of community that I've sort of sat in on, are mostly people speaking English who are from Europe or the States or other Anglo countries. And, like, they basically made a decision to stay in Mongolia and not be able to leave, and be like, if I leave, I'm probably not going to be able to come back. It actually was also expensive for them to leave. So, a few months ago, there would be these things appearing on Facebook from, like the British consulate being like, dear British citizens, like, we're going to have a flight. There's going to be a flight to repatriate people from Europe. If you want to get on it, get in touch with us. And oh, by the way, it's going to cost you like $2,000 or whatever, So there's also issues for people who are kind of stuck inside Mongolia, or are like, if I leave, can I come back, who are foreign. And there are like ongoing issues people have had to with getting, it's difficult for foreigners to get Mongolian citizenship. I only know of a couple of cases. I believe for that citizenship test, you have to like demonstrate you speak Mongolian. You have to have, I think, lived there for a number of years. It's similar to other former socialist countries. So like people who are married to Mongolians and have families, they're also facing a lot of issues.
We have a pair of questions from Tom Lutkin at the National Bureau of Asian Research and Radnoti Batanyam, both really about diplomacy, regional diplomacy. Tom asks how the pandemic, you see this playing out and affecting its regional relations with neighbors, in particular China and Russia. And Radnoti specifically brings up the mention of the 30,000 sheep that were gifted to the Chinese people. And if you think this event will affect diplomatic relations between Mongolia and China in any meaningful way, or if it's just, kind of show, as it were.
I mean, I think just to maybe close the topic of the sheep, which I initially brought up as well, I think we should also see that as an act of the Mongolian president that was directed towards the Mongolian population. There is quite a lot of xenophobia in Mongolia towards China, towards Chinese, and I think that act was also so. And I've seen and heard Mongolians saying this, like, oh, it's so great, we can help them out, and it basically elevates Mongolians' standing vis-a-vis other Mongolians. But I think also, I think that. To kind of speak more largely of sort of the region and Mongolia's place in regional diplomacy and things like that, there's been talk again of Mongolia joining the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Right now, Wang Yi, I'm not exactly sure what his position is, but he's visiting, he's a very high-level Chinese official. He's visiting 4 different countries in the region. There was actually just a big press conference by the Mongolian Foreign Affairs about those talks and his visit. So, there is certainly a lot of back and forth between Mongolia and China, and also Mongolia and Russia, and also, the three together. So that's definitely another thing that I could have noted as something to be watching, where things are happening right now. But I think that it's all pretty cooperative.
Excellent. Well, I see that being cognizant of time, we have one last question that we just have time to get to. And this is from Charlene Gavette from the Snow Leopard Conservancy. And she asks if internal travel restrictions have been lifted, and what is the state of internal restrictions within Mongolia itself?
Oh, yeah. Thank you for bringing that up, because I mentioned that there had been some put down. The last one I remember hearing about was in, I think, April. So there have been some temporary restrictions put back in place that were related to people. It was when there were a lot of cases in Russia, and they had reinstituted people crossing the border, mostly trucking and things like that. And there were a couple of times when there was suddenly a lot of people came in across the border with who tested positive. So yeah, right now there are no internal restrictions on movement. But if there's another situation where suddenly 10 people or something test positive on the northern border, that could happen again. So.
Great. Well, I see that we're at 6:13 and we have until 6:15. So that gives me just enough time to say thank you so very much, Marissa. This has been an extraordinarily educational and engaging presentation. I think all of us have really learned a lot, and very pleased to see such an interactive Q&A that obviously you really got the participants' attention. So thank you for a wonderful kickoff to this first opportunity where we've joined with Berkeley, and I hope it's one of many. Thank you to all of you who've joined. I appreciate that some of you are in Mongolia, and it's very early in the morning there. So I'll let you say your goodbyes, Marissa, but thank you all for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thanks again to the centers for the opportunity. And if anyone, I'm sorry that we couldn't get to everyone's questions. Feel free to email me or reach out to me on social media. I'm happy to talk more.
Great. Well, we look forward to seeing you all again in future panels. Thanks again.